Hi, I'm Charlie Rodman, Austin Criminal Defense Attorney, and today I'm going to tackle what I refer to as the holy grail of criminal defense informational videos, which is how much does a DWI cost? We get asked that question a lot, and it's difficult to answer because we don't know the result of the case. And so what I decided to do was come up with basically the 5 main results of a case, the typical results, okay? And every case is different, of course, but these are fairly 5 common resolutions. I'm going to start with the most expensive and sort of work backwards from there. So I'm not trying to freak you out, but the first one is basically every expense that I could even think of that could possibly happen, and then we'll move back from there. Okay, this is the first hypothetical, and it's based on someone that has been arrested for a DWI, first time, but the breath or blood was over 0.15, so the BAC is over 0.15, so it's a Class A, and in this hypothetical, the person ends up on probation for a Class A. So let me talk to you a little bit about the timeline. So we've got the arrest, and then about 3 months of administrative settings, not much is happening, and then you got about 9 months of negotiation with the prosecutor. The plea in this situation is here. We've got about 2 years of probation, okay, or community supervision, and probation is kind of what you imagine. There's a probation officer, you check in once a month, and there's a whole bunch of things you have to do. Community service, classes, you're not supposed to drink on probation. Anyway, we can talk about that more later, but this is the basic timeline. So the case ends, and then there's sort of a year after probation, and you'll see why I need to put that here in a second. So let's talk about where the costs start, and they of course start basically the first night, which is getting your car out of the impound, and I'm estimating about $225 for that. You also will most likely get a personal bond, and when it's a Class A and the BAC is higher, they often have an ignition interlock device requirement, and the bond costs a little more than normal. Normal's $40, but in this situation it's $120. Now you've got your lawyer fee, okay, and so they're different lawyers, of course, and some are cheaper than others. $5,000 is about the middle of the road. That's what we're charging right now for a first-time DWI. So the way that works is you pay the down payment of $1,000 and then $500 a month until you get to that $5,000. Now the ignition interlock device requirement that's part of a bond condition on a Class A normally costs about $80 a month. Now then you've got the CES evaluation, which is the counseling interview where they figure out what classes you need. Okay, now if it's the first DWI, they're most likely going to say just this 12-hour DWI or DWI-E class, and that's $90. And then now they typically want you to take a MAD, Victim Impact Panel class, which is 2 hours, and that costs $25. Now, when your license gets suspended, which is 90% of the time people who's arrested for DWI get their license suspended, there is a filing fee to get an occupational license. And depending on when this happens, it could be either $51 or $298, depending on the timeline. I'm putting $298 now just to do the higher fee, just so you're not surprised. When you get an occupational license, you have to have SR22 insurance. There's a broad range of how much that could cost, but on average for someone with a decent driving record, it's about $170 down and then $60 a month, and typically a license is suspended for 6 months, although it could be 3. There's a driver's license reinstatement fee, that's $135, and then when you're on probation, the probation fees plus court costs plus fines, they'll prorate that out over the 2-year period, and that's roughly $90 a month for that 2 years. Now, there's also on a Class A, usually, not all the time, but usually they want an ignition interlock device for some period, and it can be a year, it can be 2, depending on how bad the facts of the case are, but I put down here a year at $80 a month for a year. And then one final indignity, they charge you to remove it from your car, $45 there. Now, probation will involve a couple drug tests, assuming you pass. If you don't pass, there's a whole bunch of them, but roughly 3 at about $10 a piece. And then finally, if you're convicted of a DWI, there is a surcharge, and that's $3,000 over 3 years. They'll prorate that to about $90 a month for that 3-year period. So the total of all this is $13,173, give or take, for a Class A probation DWI conviction. I'm going to stop right here because you might have a couple questions. The first one being, do you have to get an occupational license? And the answer is no. You can just sit out the suspension. You would still have to pay the reinstatement fee, which would be $125 instead of $135. Second question, surcharges. Will you have to pay surcharges? And the answer is yes, unless you and your attorney can convince the judge that you're indigent. And by that means, like, your tax returns last year showed less than $17,000. It's difficult to convince them that you can't afford these surcharges, but you and your attorney can try. And then finally, a jury trial is always an option. This video really isn't about that. We can talk about that another time, but you do, of course, have a right to have a jury trial. Okay, so let's talk about hypothetical number 2. This is a Class B DWI conviction with probation, so the breath or blood was below 0.15 or there was no breath or blood at all. So it's the same chronology: arrest, administration, negotiation, plea. There's 18 months probation is typical on a Class B, and then the case ends and there's some more consequences after the case is over. So this front part is roughly the same. You've got the same amount to get your car out of the impound. The personal bond is $40 instead of $120. Lawyer fees going to be roughly the same, so $5,000. CDS evaluation, 12-hour class, 2-hour class, occupational license filing fee, SR22 insurance, driver's license reinstatement fee. And then the probation is shorter and the fine is generally a little less. So that works out to roughly $75 a month for 18 months. And then they'll still drug test you to make sure you're not using anything that you're not supposed to. And then there is still a surcharge on the DWI conviction. So the difference here is, you notice there's no ignition interlock device during this process. Of course, there can be, depending on the facts of the case, but in general, in something like this, there won't be. The total for this is $10,718. That is, of course, is an estimate. Okay, hypothetical number 3 is a DWI conviction, but with jail time instead of probation. And this is usually a situation where people choose to go to jail instead of be on probation. So the timeline's a little different. So we still have the arrest, 3 months administration, 9 months of negotiation, plea, and then you have this 1 to 10 day in jail. Now that will depend on the facts of the case and what you do up front, and there's a handful of things that'll affect that, but that's a common result for a first DWI if the client chooses to go to jail. Now then you still have, after the case ends, of course, because there's going to be surcharges. So same beginning: impound, personal bond, lawyer fee, evaluation, 12-hour class, 2-hour class, occupational filing fee, SR22, driver's license reinstatement fee, and then court costs of $450 roughly on the DWI. And then you've got your surcharge again. And the total for this is $9,818. Okay, hypothetical number 4 is if your attorney is able to get the case dismissed by a reduction from a DWI to obstruction of a highway. So let's talk about what that looks like. That's still probation, but it can be deferred probation. So let's look at this. Arrest, same, 3 months, 9 months, DWI dismissed, plea of obstruction to a highway, which is blocking a road. Okay, it's just like if we took this table and put it in the road, cars would get backed up. Pretty soon the cop's going to show up and go, who's putting tables in the road? Okay, and that's what obstruction of a highway is. Okay, so this 18 months is a typical probation on obstruction. It can be deferred, which means it's not even a conviction for the obstruction of a highway. The DWI, like I said, is dismissed, and then you've got a little bit after the case is over. So same beginning, okay? The impound, bond, lawyer's fee, classes, occupational license, and then I put this in here because often our clients do some sort of portable alcohol monitoring or even an IID, but something up front to tip the scale to convince the prosecutor to reduce it to obstruction of a highway. In this scenario, I just put 3 months of a portable alcohol monitor at $150 a month. And then you still got your probation fees at about $75 a month. And then you're still going to take a drug test. Now at the end of this, you can seal your case, okay, and that costs roughly $1,600. About $500 of that is court costs. But sealing prevents civilian agencies from seeing the obstruction of a highway. So we usually recommend doing that. You do have to wait roughly 2 years after the case is over. You'll see from this there is no surcharge there. So when your DWI is dismissed, there are no surcharges. The total for this, $97.68, okay, and that is with sealing the case. Okay, hypothetical number 5, we have worked out a dismissal of the DWI for a Class C ticket, typically like a speeding ticket or something like that. This is an extraordinary result on a DWI case, and it will completely depend on the facts and how hard our clients work or are willing to do what they're willing to do. So the beginning, you still got the same 3 months of admin, 9 months negotiation. The DWI is dismissed, then there's typically a 6-month deferral period on the ticket. Okay, and there's no probation or anything. It's just making sure you don't get in any other trouble. And then the ticket's also dismissed. Okay, so let's look at that. Still have the same front end: car out of the impound, personal bond, lawyer fee, evaluation, 12-hour class, 2-hour class, occupational license, SR22 insurance, and I put the portable alcohol monitor in this one as well. That's common if we're close to getting a ticket. Or if they're willing to do obstruction of a highway, we're always saying, okay, well, look, what if we do a monitor to get down a Class C ticket? Anyway, so put that in there. And then the ticket itself is $100 plus the court cost of $105. And then this is what the main thing that we want for all of our clients is the ability to expunge the case, and that's to completely get it off the record, deleted, destroyed. And you approximately 2 years later, that costs $1,600. About $500 of that is court costs, and the rest is attorney's fees. So the total for that type of result, if we can get it, is $8,593. All right, if you have any questions, feel free to give us a call or check out our website. I've made a lot of other informational videos about different parts of this process: the occupational license, SR22 insurance, the driver's license hearing. Anyway, there's a lot of things on the video tab on my website. Check it out.